Yeah, can you actually explain what happened with the Voting Rights Act? Because I just learned that it's not what
Yeah,
happened?
it no, it exists in a lesser form. So if all of you remember the pictures you've seen of the big marches in 1965 and 64, etc. Those were the civil rights movement was about a lot of things. It was about ending segregation. It was about jobs and a lot of things. But a huge thing that the civil rights movement was about voting rights for Black Americans. So although constitutionally Black men and then much later Black women legally got the right to vote, practically it was almost impossible to vote when in really in a lot of the northern states will pretend that they never stopped Black people from voting. That's a lie. Even California did. It was very difficult and even dangerous in a lot of southern states as well. My grandmother always tells me a story about her parents, and they kept a jar in the kitchen, and all year they put extra change into it. And then on election day, they pulled out enough money to pay the poll tax so that they could vote. And that was she was very lucky that she had a family whose parents could save up money to vote. Not everyone had that. Or they would have a grandfather clause. So if your grandfather could vote, then you could. Well, your grandfather was probably a slave if you were Black and couldn't, right? Or they would have literacy tests or all sorts of things to stop Black people from being able to vote, even though constitutionally we were allowed to. So in 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed, and it ended segregation and a lot of other things. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed. And what it did was it actually just gave the federal government power to enforce the right to vote across the country. So we were able to send in the National Guard. We were able to send in, poll workers and people to register voters, et cetera, to open up voting for everyone. And this is after my mother was born, right? This is a very recent thing at which Blacks were finally able to vote freely in this country. Then 2013 came along, and Shelby County v. Holder was argued in front of the court. And the Supreme Court of the United States, who again this year have decided that they are anti-voting rights, and in 2013 they were too. They decided that racism was over. I mean, we had a Black president, and Black folks were out here voting, so clearly racism was no longer a thing. And so they took out a big chunk of the Voting Rights Act. So when you wonder, how come I didn't hear about voter ID laws until recently? Or how come I didn't hear about voter purging until recently? Or all these things? It's because they didn't really start to happen and didn't start to take over across the country until the Supreme Court decided that we no longer needed protections in voting. And so now we have voter suppression that is back on in extremely high rates, but also in ways that are much harder to get around than paying a poll tax, because the Voting Rights Act, it wasn't completely eliminated. There's still some parts of it that stand, but the big teeth of it has been eliminated since 2013. If you care about voting rights, then you need to pay attention to what your Senate candidate is saying about what they think about voting rights and about the Voting Rights Act, because they will be the ones who help decide whether or not we get a new one passed in Congress.
It's really important to remember how the lengths that certain states and many states, and again, as Kat said, not just the South, many states have gone to make sure that that voting power is concentrated to people that are largely white, largely male, and originally, property owners.
And at the end of the day, there's one thing that I hope everyone takes from this conversation is that government, they work for us, and we do have a power to influence the way that these decisions are made, but the only way we can actually do that is if we're informed.